Peace Barricade.
Hello and welcome on the Peace Barricade. I am your host, Maria Cernat. I am an academic based in Bucharest, and the aim of this show is to spread the message of peace. And what better way to do that, if not to invite David Swanson? He is the founder, the co-founder of a very important organization promoting peace, World Beyond the War, and he is also a journalist, author, and a very, very important peace activist in the United States. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You were courageous enough to go to Russia recently to write about Russia and to have a rational perspective on the US-Russia relations, in the sense that that you were brave. Today, even mentioning that you are interested in Russia, even mentioning that you want to hear what the Russians have to say, Russian authorities, Russian intellectuals, put you in a different category of people. For most intellectuals, mainstream media journalists, you are a Russian spy, a Russian asset, a Russian Putin enabler, and all sorts of names. But you went beyond that, and you wanted to see what Russians think about US. You wanted to discuss with Russian intellectuals, diplomats. I mean, where did you summon the courage? I'm not brave enough to do that, because I know that the wave of hatred and the pushback would be enormous.
You know, there's a wonderful woman named Jill Stein who's running for president in the United States as a hopeless independent third party in a system that is, structured so that only two horrible parties have any chance whatsoever. And she was demonized and denounced and condemned for years and years, still to this day, for a photograph of her at a table with Vladimir Putin and others having dinner. And I had been invited to go on that trip. In fact, I had been invited to run as vice president with her. And I was, just lucky that I didn't go and wasn't so denounced and condemned. But it's absolutely absurd, for to think it was a bad thing to sit at a table with someone, regardless of what you might be thinking or saying. Just sitting at a table with a demonized person, and you're condemned for life. I actually was approached several years ago by the Russian military and asked if I would, for money, take articles that they wrote and publish them under my name. And instead, I publicly denounced them for proposing that. And so every time that I'm accused of being a Russian agent and a Russian spy, I pull that out and say, but look at this article I published denouncing them for asking me to push their propaganda. I'm not claiming Russia has no propaganda. I'm claiming I refused their money and told them if they wanted to speak to me openly and honestly, I would write what I thought under my name. But I used to go on Russia TV all the time, until the United States government got rid of it. And I would say the exact same thing I would say anywhere else, including criticizing Russia. And they would have me back on again. When I would go on MSNBC or CNN and criticize the United States military, I was never seen again. I haven't been invited back on any, major U.S. channels for years and years because I would criticize the U.S. military. Russia, maybe they were desperate for guests. Maybe they were more open to criticism. I don't know. But Russia TV, you could go on. Now, I show up in lists of Ukraine's enemies and so forth, but these are not taken seriously by most serious people because they're just invented by blatant propagandists and proven forgers and liars. So going on a trip to Russia with a bunch of friends to meet a bunch of friendly Russian people, I mean, I don't think that was terribly risky in terms of ending up with a bad reputation or whatever, much less being attacked by the evil Russians. You know, this is nonsense. I came back and publicly spoke. I just went to Russia. This is what I saw, and I don't think. I mean, who knows who doesn't call you because you've been to Russia? But I don't think I've suffered for that.
I understand. You know what I was thinking, since I am a socialist, I always find it difficult to say that, oh, I only fight war per se. I am a pacifist and I don't care about anything else. Because for me, and I'm very interested in your perspective, for me, war is fantastic for a class of people, for the war profiteers. And my fight for peace is a war against these people. I cannot see a fight for peace if we don't discuss this class element and this conflict. And the fact that for some people, a few, of course, not many, war is a fantastic business. I remember Max Blumenthal saying at one point that in the United States, after the war in Ukraine started, you could have seen villas and mansions appearing out of the blue because a lot of people made a lot of money out of the war. War is a business, and then you have the business class of profiteers, and for them, war is fantastic. So can we fight war without this class element and disregarding the fact that this is the class of profiteers that would do anything in their power to maintain and to even provoke war?
Well, that's very clear to me and to many people. It's not allowed in U.S. corporate media, but you had U.S. Congress members openly bragging of how much money they were going to make from their investments in weapons while they were pushing for sending weapons to Ukraine. You had the heads of the largest weapons companies in the world, the top 5 of which are all based right next to Washington, D.C., saying how wonderful this was for business. Even the war on Gaza, how terrific for business. So these are sociopathic people saying things that used to be unacceptable. You know, you go back to the 1920s, 1930s in this country, and it was shameful. It was unacceptable. I hope you're not hearing all the echoing I'm hearing. And it was called war profiteering, and it was a dirty word. And these were the merchants of death. And now they openly brag about it. And that's a cultural change. It's shameful. But the fact is, when you go to Russia, you don't, unless you're a merchant of death, meet the Russian merchants of death. You meet the ordinary Russian people. And none of them want war, just like the ordinary people in the United States. None of them want war. And this is, I think people in the United States have benefited for many, many years from the ability of people in other countries to distinguish between the U.S. government and the U.S. people and say, oh, that's not the U.S. people who want to murder us all. It's just the U.S. government, and the U.S. people can't control it. The U.S. public is not quite as good at that, has to learn that to distinguish the Russian government from the Russian people, etc.
At the same time, I don't see how we can achieve peace. And I very much like the fact that you don't want to end just one war, but war in general. But to me, war is a business. And if you don't dismantle a business model where you have a small minority of people telling everybody else what to do and holding, you know, all the means of production and being an extreme position of power, and they also are responsible for huge levels of inequality. And I don't see how we can dismantle war in general if we don't attack this economic aspect and we don't see it as a business.
Well, I don't either, and I am 1,000% in favor of attacking this economic model and seeing it as a business. And anything I might have said, I'm sorry for all the echoing if you're hearing it. Anything I might have said that hinted at anything otherwise, I am deeply and shamefully regretful of. But I think it needs to be explained to a lot of people who don't understand it, who think that war is a patriotic, music thumping, flag waving enterprise of the good country against the 200 evil countries. And I try to get in the United States towns and universities to take their money out of weapons, and they wave the damn flags and shout about Uncle Sam and all the patriotic horseshit. And I tell them these companies are making weapons for 96 countries, 95 of which are not your flag and your music. In fact, I don't know of any wars without US made weapons on both sides of those wars. How do you square your nationalistic patriotism with the reality, with the fact that the US provides more weapons to other countries than the rest of the world put together, that the US is the top supplier of weapons to dictatorships, which supposedly the US is against, that the United States locks in decades into the future weapon gifts and weapons sales to other countries that are horrible, brutal governments, so that the US Congress and the US people can have to say that anti-war hero Bernie Sanders wants to have a vote on blocking the next $20 billion of weapons to Israel after the US election, so that first everybody votes and then the senators tell everybody what they're for. That we have given over to NATO, an unelected institution that is principally a weapons dealer, the largest weapons dealer the world has ever seen, the right to badger governments about their fundamental policies and force governments to 2% if you ask Joe Biden, 3% if you ask Donald Trump, of their economy has to go into the mass murder industry coming out of schools and healthcare and environmental protection. What does this have to do with your patriotic democracy propaganda? Nothing, but there were people getting stinking rich. It was a Lockheed Martin employee who went to Eastern Europe in the 1990s and said, your country can be in NATO if you buy our weapons. And then took more money and put it into US congressional campaigns through what the rest of the world calls bribery, but we call campaign contributions. It made those congressmen vote to put those countries into NATO. And now, 30 years later, you invent this mythology that people wanted NATO. It was a popular uprising. They demanded that their countries become part of NATO, this voluntary, peaceful institution that only fights defensive wars, even though none of its wars have even pretended to be defensive. So, there has to be this willingness to ignore facts if you're not going to see war as the largest, corruption, protection racket, criminal cartel that the world has seen.
Yes, I fully agree. And let me tell you that this cartel also has this intellectual branch, because in Romania, for instance, taking advantage of the fact that we were still traumatized by a very, very authoritarian leader that was Nicolae Ceausescu. And we were looking, at the United States with the hopes that one day we will live like the top 1%, because in the Hollywood movies, you didn't see much of, what's going on in the Bronx or other areas. So we were so much, in love with the United States. So taking advantage of that, and they sold, and they were very good also in selling these ideas. And let me tell you that in Romania, people, and still to this day, if you look at the research, still to this day, people think it's a good idea to enter NATO, to be a member, to buy more weapons and all the rest. But you know what I want to say now, to ask you? The rise of neoliberalism, I think, took more and more areas, and this is only a hypothesis and a question, I'm not sure if this is the case, took more and more areas of the army, in the sense that you have almost a privatized army nowadays. I mean, you have contractors, you have people who wash dishes, but there are companies who do that. There are people who wash and companies, private companies that are washing the clothes of the soldiers. So you have huge chunks of what we call in general army that is basically privatized. At the same time, you have the weapons manufacturers who produce for money. So you have, I think, a very small portion of the army that is still a public institution, and you have all these profiteers, all these people who are, trying to use this to their personal advantage and use all this propaganda and all the rest. But in the essence, I think more and more of the American army became privatized. Is this true?
Yeah, of course it's true. And an extremely evil person about whom Kamala Harris is very proud to have just received an endorsement is principally responsible. That is, Dick Cheney worked in the U.S. government, went and ran a private corporation called Halliburton, came back into the U.S. government and said, let's take half the stuff the military does, all the cooking and cleaning, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, all of this stuff, and let's privatize it and give it to this company called Halliburton so I can make more money while working in the U.S. government. And then, and this sort of corruption is very normal. But also, the U.S. military bases, these 917 bases outside the United States, are apartheid states where the work that isn't given to companies like Halliburton is given to the local people who look different, who speak different, who are treated as subhuman, and who come onto the base and mow the grass and wash the clothes and then get off the base and go home, and who are subject to the laws of the United States government, while the United States troops can go off the base and still aren't subject to the laws of the country they're occupying. But beyond that, the U.S. military has mechanized, automated everything it could so that machines do a lot of what U.S. troops used to do, including actual killing and destroying, and has employed mercenary forces for private companies that hire themselves out to do the killing to the highest bidder, whether it's the United States or someone else. And most especially has focused on using other people's troops. It's Israeli troops using U.S. weapons. It's Ukrainian troops using U.S. weapons, because the U.S. public has been conditioned for many, many decades to believe that for a single U.S. soldier to die is a horrific tragedy, as of course it is. But for other people to die is, just not of any concern whatsoever. 500,000 children in Iraq, who cares? It was worth it. Don't even have to know what it was, according to Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State. So, it's okay to fight to the last Ukrainian. It's okay to fight to the last Israeli and Palestinian. But U.S. troops have to be kept out of it. Of course, they won't be. They're sending more U.S. troops to the Middle East right now. They're sending more U.S. troops to Europe right now because these things get out of control, and then the U.S. troops have to be used. But this is the drive. This is the driving force. More even than profiting is making sure you can have wars without any deaths from that special chosen 4% of humanity that's called U.S. citizens.
Yeah, but I listened because ever since the war in Ukraine started, I started to listen to a lot of the military analysis And some of these military specialists from the United States, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Scott Ritter, McGregor, and all the others that discuss the conflict in Ukraine. But they say something very interesting. They say that this business model of producing weapons is not necessarily the best one because it's time consuming, is very costly, and in this direct confrontation with Russia is not even as efficient as they may think or someone may think it was. Since in an organized and a planned economy, producing this type of weaponry is much more efficient. I don't know what's your position on that.
Well, I don't share Scott Ritter's desire to make militaries more efficient or to figure out better ways to commit mass murder. It's not in my interest. It's not my goal. But I think the United States is extremely efficient at mass producing weapons. And when you look just a few days ago, the president of Ukraine was with the governor of the state of Pennsylvania at a U.S. weapons company in Joe Biden's hometown, signing his name on artillery shells to be used for mass murder back in Ukraine and doing open, happy U.S. election interference, which is only a scandal if it's Russian. And this is a factory that has been upgraded and expanded and put into 24/7 mass production of tools for mass murder in Ukraine. Russia has similar factories and they're churning away. And they're not economically efficient for either economy. That is, you could have more jobs, better paying jobs, better economic impact by spending money on anything else or not taxing money from ordinary working people at all. But I don't think if the U.S. had more and better weapons factories, Ukraine would have won this war. I think that's nonsense. And the same with Russia. I think, it comes down to the fact that this is a stalemate and was always going to be a stalemate, and people are going to continue dying until somebody decides to use nuclear weapons.
Yes, this is a real danger. Please tell me from your visit to Russia, from what you were able to discuss, because you discussed the intellectual diplomats, journalists, ordinary people. Do you think that they are mentally somehow prepared that this is the next level and that if somebody attacks them, they should defend themselves by using nuclear weapons?
I have no idea. I have no facts to base any characterization of the sort on. I didn't survey a large section of the Russian public on what they think of using nuclear weapons. But I would be shocked if a large percentage of them did want to use nuclear weapons. I know there have been polls in the United States that found, a significant minority ready to use nuclear weapons to destroy North Korea. But these are people so ignorant that they believe you can use nuclear weapons in North Korea and it won't have any impact on the United States. The radiation won't move through the air. The nuclear weapons won't come back from North Korea and China to the United States, that it will just be killing people who don't matter over there. And so I don't think the Russian people are in general that ignorant. And I think that they think of war as being closer to them geographically. They think of war in Europe as being where they live. Moscow is in Europe. And they don't think of it as being somewhere else and leaving them untouched. So I would be shocked if you had a huge percentage of Russians wanting nuclear war. Now, people who are high up in the Russian government, then I would not be so shocked. People who are high up in the U.S. government, I would not be so shocked. But the general public in either country, wanting nuclear war or thinking that we have to resort to nuclear war, I mean, you would think it because they support policies that push us in that direction, just recklessly, needlessly drive us toward where the scientists say we're closer than we've ever been to nuclear apocalypse. But they haven't thought it through. It's more ignorance than willful elimination of all life on Earth, I think.
Yes, yes, definitely. There was a discussion where there was this threat of nuclear war, and there was this thing, dialogue at the pharmacy. Oh, I want iodine pills. What do you want them for? But I heard that there will be a nuclear war, and the pharmacist just looked in shock and said, "Sir, if a nuclear war starts, you won't be able to reach the drawer where you keep your pills. So rest assured that these iodine pills are gonna do nothing." But this is the level of ignorance. But the final point, why do you think the pacifist movement lost its momentum? Because it was a thing where during the Cold War, people were scared of the nuclear threat. There were demonstrations, and even in Romania, in communist Romania, we had this idea, the nuclear war, the dangers of nuclear war. And now people came to the conclusion that you buy some iodine pills and you'll be safe.
Yeah, well, the Hollywood movies that you mentioned earlier, the United States military puts money and allows use of its territory and its equipment, and takes editorial control, can determine what stays and what doesn't in these movies in many cases. And people think they're private works of art. These are propaganda in every sense. And the city of New York put out a movie that I believe is worse than You Need to Take Pills. They produced a short film that said, in the case of a nuclear war, you need to go indoors. Go indoors. You'll be okay. Order pizza. Well, there are no phones and no pizzas, and so there's an active creation of ignorance and stupidity. But I think a lot of what happened is that the anti-nuclear movement had tremendous success and got rid of the vast majority of the nuclear weapons. And that was twisted into the belief that the work was done. The work was complete. We can only destroy the entire planet a few hundred times instead of tens of thousands of times. So we're okay now. Destroying the whole planet once ought to be enough to keep the movement going. But there was, we say back in the Cold War, right? You just said back in the Cold War. The only reason people think the Cold War ended is because the talk changed, the conversations changed, the communications between the United States and Russia changed, and the Soviet Union became Russia. But the nuclear danger never went away, never for an instant. It was reduced from, how many multiple times you could destroy all life on Earth to a smaller number. And so people ought not to have ever let up. But they did. They were told they succeeded, and they did succeed, and they showed how to succeed. But they shouldn't have stopped. They shouldn't have stopped. They should have escalated. When a nonviolent activist movement to change the world is succeeding, it has to escalate, not go home and rest on its laurels. And this was the mistake. So we have to rewrite this history, not by inventing fiction, but by reanalyzing the facts and acknowledging that the Cold War did not end.
Yeah, for now, there is this discussion, the final thought, there is this discussion of multipolarity and the idea that it will somehow be a progress in the sense that now the delicate balance of terror will not be that the whole world is afraid of the United States, but you have more bullies at the table, right? And when you have more bullies at the table, you have a more dynamic, balance of terror. But from my perspective, if something fundamental doesn't change in the way these powers see the world, these political and economic and financial elites see the world, then nothing is solved with more of the same. If you have more bullies on the table, then you got nowhere, isn't it? So the multipolarity in itself is not really a source of hope.
I couldn't agree more. And it's something that a great many anti-war activists in the United States and in Europe need to understand. People who stood side by side with me against US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and dozens of US wars, who believe Russian war making is good and war making by Palestinians is good, and war making by anyone who's outside of NATO is good, and it would be progress to have a balance of powers, and the more power and the more warmongering power that BRICS can get, the better, because it's not NATO, because it's not the United States. But I don't want war making by a greater number of smaller empires. It doesn't make us safer. That doesn't mean I want war making by the US empire, not for a second. I want the universal rule of law applied to all equally. I want the United States stripped of the veto in the Security Council. I want the General Assembly empowered, and Russia and China and France and England too. And I want the General Assembly empowered democratically and reformatted, not to give the Secretary General more powers as they're doing. The Secretary General, who just admitted, as many good NGOs will not, that these institutions are out of date and not working. I want the United Nations democratized, and I want the International Court of Justice complied with by all nations. I want the International Criminal Court to issue warrants that its prosecutor requests, even if they're not for people from Africa. And this is the solution. Is universal standards. You might even call it a rules-based order, not the growth of the U.S. empire, and not the replacement of the U.S. empire with other militarized empires. This is not going to save us.
At the same time, we're approaching the end of our discussion, but what the problem is? That the current power dynamics in the international arena create this type of autocratic opposition. I mean, if you are a small country, let's say you are the president of, I don't know, not small, but important, but smaller than the US, say Turkey. How do you oppose US? I tell you what I will do. Even though I'm a feminist, I'm a pacifist, I know that my only chance is to get the people from the secret services on my side, so I have to give them big salaries. I will have to have the army on my side, because otherwise the United States will organize a coup and they will throw me out of power. So I have to have them on my side. And all of a sudden I have a macho militaristic state. With the security apparatus, with the military apparatus, I know that I have to have the financial elite on my side. So as long as the United States is constantly applying this pressure, the only way, if you want to go against it, you need this type of allies. I don't believe in this ideal when I will forge alliance with fellow women and fellow activists, and we will go in the streets singing and all the rest. I don't think that will work. And I think the change has to start from the United States, because as long as the United States applies this kind of pressure, the only type of leader that is going to go against it and really stand the chance will be this type of authoritarian politician.
I respectfully disagree. I do think the United States encourages authoritarian government in its allies and in its enemies. And I think that when it threatens a government like Iran, it does not encourage democracy in Iran. It encourages authoritarian resistance to outside militarism in Iran. And when it militarizes Turkey and puts more and more weapons, including nuclear weapons, in Turkey, and makes it part of NATO, and insists that it be part of its wars. It's not encouraging democracy, but I don't think that the only solution to that is authoritarian opposition to the United States. I don't think every abuse by the Cuban government against the Cuban people can be excused simply because of the U.S. blockade of Cuba, evil and destructive as the U.S. blockade of Cuba is. I think you can look to the examples of countries like Costa Rica that have gotten rid of their military entirely and are better off for it. And when you look at some of the cases of preventing military bases that we discussed in our recent annual conference in No War 2024, and you look at a place like Montenegro that has successfully prevented a massive new NATO military base, the best way to do that is through creating more democracy in Montenegro and opposing the military base together, both in Montenegro and in Washington, D.C., and around Europe and through the European government and council and parliament. And I think it matters that, in fact, the nations up in the Baltics kicked the Soviet Union out precisely by getting together and singing. I think it's wonderful to watch this movie called The Singing Revolution and see that NATO chest pumping and NATO weapons, NATO membership, which wasn't there, it had nothing to do with it. You know, that in fact, nonviolent activism is extremely powerful, even when it sounds ridiculous and silly and involves people singing, because you cannot tell 100,000 singing people what to do. They will not listen to you. They will go on singing.
This is a very hopeful message. I based my analysis on Lindsay O'Rourke covered regime change operations, and she said that the most vulnerable political systems are democracies. I mean, from all the countries, the U.S. Secret Service's attack during the Cold War, democracies were the most vulnerable, unfortunately, and the only ones that were able to maintain their opposition were kind of this autocrats and authoritarian leaders. But this doesn't exclude the possibility of having this type of singing revolution against war. And I would like very much to end on this positive note, because it's very pessimistic to have this idea that the only way you can oppose this war machine of the US is through this type of anti-democratic leadership. Thank you so much for joining us. And to the viewers, if you like what you saw, please share our content. It's very important to spread the message of peace, especially in these very, very troubled times. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Peace, Barricade.